Okay, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for having this meeting so regularly. I wanted to present this talk today, which is done with, this work is done with Rajkumar Sadhu, who was a PhD student at SN Bose Center, and this is part of his thesis work. Right now, he is doing postdoc at Weizmann Institute. So inside a cell, we have these actin filaments which grow and they push against the cell membrane. And in this process, they deform the cell membrane, they form small protrusions in the membrane. And these membrane protrusions play an important role in cell motility. So for a long time, people have been trying to understand how these membrane protrusion formations are controlled by the mechanical properties of the membrane. For example, in this experiment, they had shown that by artificially increasing the membrane tension, they had shown that the rate of protrusion actually goes down. And around the same time, this another experiment was performed where they had shown sometimes membrane tension can also enhance in protrusion formation. For example, they had, in this experiment, they had shown that if you increase the membrane tension, sometimes it streamlines the actin polymerization in one given direction, and therefore membrane protrusion along that direction grows pretty fast. So we are interested in the general question that how the elastic interaction in a flexible membrane is that influences the mechanism of protrusion formation. And this is a general question which is not only relevant for cell motility, but in general when you are considering a flexible membrane and some deformation, shape deformation of that flexible membrane, then these questions can be relevant. So this is the model we are studying. We consider a one-dimensional membrane, and its time evolution is being governed by this Hilfrich Hamiltonian, and there are some rod-like filaments which are pushing the membrane from below. These are free filaments which are not touching the membrane, so they can just polymerize and grow. But if a filament is bound to the membrane, in order to grow, they need to create protrusion in the membrane and then they can grow. So as you can see from the form of the Hamiltonian, this is the surface energy, this is the bending energy. They involve gradients of height. So the membrane would like to stay as flat as possible because height gradients cost energy. On the other hand, these growing filaments can grow only by creating protrusions which have energy cost. So there is a competition. And also another constraint we have is the membrane always has to stay above the filament tip. So in some sense, the filament tip actually provides a lower bound of the membrane height at that point. Okay. So, and we assume periodic boundary condition for the membrane, it's not pinned or anything. So therefore, as the filaments are growing, the membrane, shifts the pushes the membrane upward. So pushed by the growing filaments, the membrane develops an average speed in steady state. And generally, you would expect that as you increase sigma or kappa, the surface tension or bending rigidity, the membrane velocity should decrease monotonically. Because with increasing sigma or kappa, the membrane becomes more rigid. It should become much difficult for the filaments to push the membrane. So therefore, the velocity should decrease monotonically. But what we find is that when we plot V versus sigma as a function of, keeping kappa constant, then if we keep kappa constant at a small value, for example, the blue curve, then we find indeed the velocity decreases monotonically with sigma as expected. But when we fix kappa at an intermediate or large value, then the velocity first decreases, reaches a minimum, increases, reaches a peak, and then finally decreases again. So this behavior is counterintuitive. In particular, this regime where it shows that there is a range in sigma across which when you increase sigma, the velocity is increasing more and more. Also, I will come back to these two aspects later, but since the plot is right here, let me just mention it. In the large sigma limit, the decay is exponential. This can be seen from here, and the peak position which actually shifts leftward as you increase kappa. So I will come back to these 2 points later. But the main point that I wanted to make here is this: there is a range in epsilon, sigma, where the velocity increases with sigma. So to probe deeper into it, we also measured the energy cost. So let us say that the energy cost for creating a protrusion at the binding site. that energy cost can be written as sum of two terms, surface energy cost and bending energy cost. I use these notations to denote them. And when we plot these energy costs measured in simulation as a function of sigma, we find that the surface energy cost increases monotonically with sigma, but the bending energy cost first increases, reaches a peak, decreases and then saturates. And this thing happens in the range when sigma is small and we have already fixed kappa at a large value. So the total energy cost is being controlled by the bending energy cost. So the total energy cost, which is the green curve, that also increases, reaches a peak, decreases, and finally when this thing saturates, it follows the increase in the surface energy cost and shows increase. So indeed, as we had expected, there is a range in sigma over which the energy cost for creating a protrusion actually goes down with sigma. So this is actually counterintuitive, but it turns out that there is a very simple explanation behind this. This is a schematic diagram. Just imagine a membrane and in the range when sigma and kappa both are large. So the membrane tries to stay as flat as possible because any height gradients are very costly. Now you are pushing the membrane at one point. So what you would expect that the height will be slightly larger than the neighboring points at the forcing point, but height would vary very slowly here and you can almost neglect the higher order derivatives of height. So the membrane profile can be approximated like it looks almost linear, okay? Now if you look at the red curve. Now suppose I keep kappa constant at the large value but decrease sigma. So when I decrease sigma, then qualitative shape of the membrane does not change, but the height profile becomes more steeper. And then what happens at this point, there is a very large bending energy cost, okay? Because bending energy depends on H double primed. And here the curvature becomes very large, so the bending energy becomes very large. So therefore, as you keep on lowering sigma, this shape cannot sustain anymore. So finally, for even lower sigma, the protrusion shape changes. It's not linear anymore, it varies more slowly. And this actually, when this happens, then a lot of bending energy is released. And this is the main reason behind the phenomena that we observe. So to test this picture, we measured the membrane profile in simulation. Here we have fixed kappa at large value, and you see that when I look at a relatively large value of sigma, it is linear. When I decrease the sigma value, it is still linear, but if you look at the y scale, you will see that it is much more steeper now. And finally, when sigma value is really low, the shape change, the membrane profile changes and it just rounds off at this point. You can also convince yourself that when this happens, the fourth derivative of height, which actually decides the bending energy cost to create a protrusion, that shows a peak, because when you start from large sigma and decrease sigma, then the bending energy cost, the minimum of H double primed, that becomes sharper as you go from here to here. So the curvature of H double prime, that is fourth derivative of height, it increases. But then when this thing happens, then the fourth derivative of height actually decreases. So the bending energy cost actually shows a peak. When we do the same thing for small kappa value, however, we don't find this effect. We find for small kappa values, the height profile remains linear for all sigma values. Although in this case also bending energy cost is increasing, but bending rigidity is not large enough. So the energy cost is not significant enough to bring about this qualitative change in the protrusion's shape. We can also analytically try to understand this effect. So we can write down the time evolution equation for the membrane like this. This is the surface term, this is the bending term, this is a point force that we have assumed, and this is a noise. Note that point force is really not the very correct description of the model that I am simulating because of this thing that the height cannot come below the filament tip, etc. So this is a simplistic description, but nevertheless it captures the main effect. If you go to the co-moving frame and do noise averaging, then you can analytically solve for the average height profile. And this solution has this form. So when you plot this function for different sigma and kappa, indeed you find the effect that I was describing. For example, look at these two diagrams. Here for kappa is large, kappa is 1, and sigma is large here when it is almost linear, and when sigma decreases it rounds off. So this effect can be also analytically explained. Now using this, I can now quantitatively explain the full V sigma curve. So the membrane velocity is a result from both upward and downward movement of the membrane. So let us say epsilon I plus minus denotes the change energy cost for changing height from Hi to Hi plus minus delta. Then you can calculate it easily from the form of the Hiltrich Hamiltonian that it should have this form. Now at steady state, everywhere the membrane velocity is same. So I will write down the expression for the membrane velocity at the binding site, and this can be written as sum of 3 terms. First term corresponds to the polymerization of the bound filament. When the bound filament polymerizes, it pushes the membrane. Second term corresponds to thermal fluctuations of the membrane upward, and the third term corresponds to thermal fluctuations of the membrane downward, and this 1 minus P naught just gives you the probability that the filament is not bound to the membrane. Only then the membrane can fluctuate downward. Now the point is, in the limit when kappa is large, sigma is small, the total energy cost can be approximately written as the bending energy cost. I am neglecting the surface energy cost here. And then when you put in the expression for the bending energy cost, you get this expression for V. And you can easily see from here that this fourth derivative, when it reaches a peak, decreases, when it increases, reaches a peak, decreases. Accordingly, velocity also decreases, reaches a minimum and starts increasing again. But after some, this is, we are talking about as a function of sigma, right? So when sigma becomes large, then we cannot neglect the surface energy anymore. So therefore, this expression for V is not valid anymore. However, now, just one more minute I will need. Now both sigma and kappa are large. So what we can neglect here is the height gradient, because the height gradients are really tiny, and then the expression for V simplifies further. It just becomes like this, and you see for fixed kappa it decreases exponentially with sigma, which is what we find in simulation. Not only that, the decay constant is also matching quite closely. If you estimate 2 beta delta square here, you get the value 3.52. And in simulation actually we find it 3.6 here. And another part that I promised to come back to is how the peak position shifts with kappa. That is also easy to understand from this expression, because as kappa is fixed at a larger value, there is you can start neglecting height derivatives even at smaller sigma values, which means the exponential decay starts at a smaller sigma value. So the peak position shifts leftward with kappa, which is also consistent with the simulation. So just I have run out of time. Just one point I would like to make is that if you do the opposite thing, like fix sigma and look at it as a function of kappa, then there is no non-monotonicity. That can also be explained easily. And I will just leave the conclusion slide here for you to read.
So we have time for one question.